If your mission dies the second your ego is bruised, you're not really on a mission. My name is Fari, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through how I'm actively thinking about the bigger game that I'm actively playing, how I'm thinking about this, and how I'm using it inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems. So the other day, I was casually just scrolling on X, and I came across a post or a response from a founder, the founder of Boom Supersonic, which is Blake Scholl, which ultimately changed my narrative in terms of my way of thinking. And this question was, what if SpaceX challenged Boom with Starship? And this question, I'm a super space guy if no one actively knows this, but his response really stuck with me. And his response said, if it works and puts Boom out of business, I'll happily do it for humanity and be grateful to go work for Elon if he would have me. And this one question hit me so hard because it shows what it looks like when the mission matters more than the ego. And I think if you're building for recognition, you break the second someone else outpaces you. And ultimately understanding that if you're building for the mission, even quote unquote losing is even a win because ultimately progress is achieved. And I think this changed the entire narrative in terms of how I was thinking, because for me, in my frame of thinking, I thought, hey, why would someone else in this position running a big company ultimately give up what they're doing simply because they were run out of business? But then it made me really realize that, hey, what is more important is the mission. And if you're able to be the person that ultimately carries the mission forward in any capacity, I think that is a life worth living. And I didn't think about this in this specific way until I saw this question post when I saw it, and I was like, hey, this is super interesting to see that someone at such a high level is ultimately thinking in terms of the mission at first. And that ultimately made me realize that for me, in terms of what we're building in terms of Killer Chaos OS, it's not necessarily just being the person at the forefront in terms of being the person that ultimately redefines the industry or reshapes industries, but ultimately just carrying the mission forward, which is ultimately redefining and reshaping industries and making a contribution to humanity, which I think is super important towards the mission. And I think shifting my narrative now going into the future to focus on how can I actively just contribute to that mission, rather than saying, hey, I want to be the most famous person, I want to be the the star of this XYZ, whatever it is that we're actively building. I think what matters most, especially like if you start to get to that high level, is ultimately focusing on the mission. And I think this is ultimately is one of the things or the pillars that is ultimately gonna be my source of truth as I'm building into the future, which is ultimately understanding that what carries weight and what matters a lot more is the mission. And if I'm able in any capacity to ultimately drive the mission forward in terms of bringing back in the efficiency a lot forward than it is today, ultimately that is something worth getting excited about and building, because it's not always just about waking up and saying, hey, I want to be the guy at the forefront, and I want to do all of this, because you kind of get sidetracked in terms of the mission. And I think the mission is the one important facet or aspect that ultimately you need to focus on, and focusing on that sole mission and saying, hey, whatever happens externally or whatever, as long as I make the contribution to the world, and that is ultimately what my service and being useful is ultimately going to be about. Because I think for me, I think reshifting my frame of thinking towards how can I actively make a contribution. It doesn't have to be the massive contribution, but in any capacity that actively moves things forward. Because sometimes we think that, hey, technology ultimately just improves over time, it just linearly improves, and no one has to do anything about it. But ultimately, one of the concepts that I've been thinking about a lot lately after seeing this post is ultimately understanding that, hey, technology is a man-made thing, and most man-made things don't improve unless there are people contributing to it in any shape or form capacity. That contribution ultimately pushes what we're able to do a lot further into the future, which ultimately redefines the way that I'm actively thinking about things. Because I to be honest, was always thinking that, hey, I want to be the guy that always does XYZ and redefines the industries and be the back end ops king and all of these things. But ultimately, focusing a lot more on the mission is one of the core things that I want to actively change. And saying, hey, for me, it's a reminder that the system I'm building for myself, it's ultimately how I think, how I solve problems, but it ultimately has to be a service to the mission. And I think being a service to the mission has to be, taking center stage in order to say, hey, I'm actively, focusing on how I can build this in order to be a service to the mission. Because I don't necessarily have to be, the spotlight in terms of, the number one guy that everyone knows for XYZ, but ultimately understanding that the mission is one of the most important things that I need to be focusing on a day-to-day basis, and saying, hey, at the end of the day, the world rewards the people who push humanity forward, not the people who need the credit. And I think a lot of focus, I've seen, many times, from my experience, that a lot of people say, I want to be the person that ultimately, is the guy that's recognized for building XYZ and, at the forefront and getting all this fame and accolades. But ultimately, I now reshape my focus simply because of that tweet. And you never really understand how a tweet can have so much of an impact. It's been 3 days now since I have seen it, and this ultimately, reshapes the way that I think about things. That, hey, I don't have to take center stage. I don't have to be the number one guy that is ultimately at the forefront. As long as I'm able to make a contribution to the world in any shape or form or capacity, specifically now that, we're focusing deeply on, back-end systems, I think that is the most that I ultimately just want to drive the vision forward for Killer Chaos OS, to make a contribution, and everything else will run as a byproduct of that. If, for example, like, we create insane amounts of value, that is ultimately what we're actively needing to strive for, to be a service to the mission, to ultimately build the next generation of back-end systems. And I think reshifting everything to focusing on being service to the mission is ultimately gonna, make sure that we get there, because we're not going to be influenced in terms of, saying, hey, we're not making enough money, for example, or we're making too much money, or we're doing all these things and all these things are going wrong, simply because we're so hell-bent on focusing on the mission. And I think, ultimately pushing that narrative forward to say, hey, we're ultimately going to be mission first orientated and build everything else around that, to say, hey, each and every single day we're going to wake up and we're going to say, hey, this is the core thing that we want Killer Chaos OS to be. We're going to push the mission forward, even if we don't get to number one spot, but we want to be the best of the best, 100%. But ultimately understanding that as long as we're able to make that technological, contribution, then we're paving the way forward in order to build the next generation of backend infrastructure. Because at the same time, if we don't do it, then ultimately who else, there may come a time, people that may do it, but no one else is going to do it with our unique set of, perspective on the world, and also the experiences that we've also, had. And ultimately understanding that if we're going to build this vision, we need to build it in a way that is unique to us, and ultimately make sure that that works. And as long as we can, make a contribution in any shape or form, we're ultimately, making a service or making a contribution to the mission. And I think this is one of the most important things that I want to, take with me as a source of truth moving on, to say, hey, we can have all the money in the world, we can have all these accolades, we can have all these, awards and all these things, but none of that really truly matters unless we're focusing, on being a service to the mission. And how do we actively do that? We just keep pushing forward what it is that we're actively doing on a day-to-day basis, keep the same level of intensity, and say, hey, no external factors are ultimately going to deter us from, making a contribution towards, the enhancement of technology into the future, because that is ultimately, the modes that I want to make, this contribution for now, especially in this phase in time of my life when I'm just, just super focused on building on that. And I want to take this, as a source of truth in order to build into the future, because I know that, as long as I take, this mindset of being a service to the mission, I think that is most important. And sometimes, sometimes you do get kind of sidetracked, and I have fallen victim to that 100%. I'm not perfect in any shape or form, but ultimately bringing that back to say, hey, I need to actively, be focusing each and every single day on being a service to the mission, and not letting that go, and just being really relentless and saying, hey, I'm just gonna, build this vision and be super, deep into it, to make sure that each and every single day we're moving the needle forward, and making sure that The overarching goal is ultimately being a service to the mission. Because if you look at SpaceX, and you look at Boom Supersonic, if they weren't so super focused on the mission, those companies wouldn't even have existed. And what source of truth or what nugget could I possibly take from that is ultimately focusing a lot more on the mission, and everything else will come as a byproduct of that. It's just focusing on the mission as a core, and then ultimately building everything else around that. And I think this is ultimately, one of the things that is going to change the entire trajectory in terms of the way that I think about, back-end infrastructures and all the different plays I'll be making into the future, simply because I now really truly understand the game that I want to be playing and the game that I need to be playing, which is constantly focusing on being a service to the mission. Because, once that ultimately, takes hold, it ultimately matters a lot more than my ego. So if we have to kind of, pivot and, change directions, but as long as we're ultimately striving towards making that contribution, I know we're going to be a huge service into the future for humanity. And if we just keep pushing this mission forward, I know we're going to get a lot closer each and every single day. We're going to make mistakes, we're going to get some things wrong, we're going to make mistakes as always, but ultimately each and every single day we're going to keep the same level of intensity and just build. And I know through that we're going to get one step closer each and every single day. And if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.